these are actually on the wobbly side of the stands. These were the stands I had that I had these on, and they're supposed to be strong this way, not this way. So, pretty cool. Watch this. But yeah, I have this at I think this is around 15 pounds. But these things do a very, very good job at force canceling. They actually still make them. They came out with the XQ series as a high-end pairing, and then they continued making them, and they still make them now as a T2 slimline. And so all they did was basically took the same amp, the same electronic internals, same driver, and they squared it off, put it in a square wooden box, and now they sell it as a slimline sub that you could put under your couch. This was also designed as a sub you could put under your couch, as you can see by the spikes that it came with. These, so like, the whole entire thing is basically just metal with like rubber gaskets. You could actually take this thing off, and then these things go underneath your couch, and it sits sideways. And I never understood whether I'd rather have the more rumble, the active side or the passive side facing upwards. It kind of just depends. It depends on the couch, really. Because whatever couch you have, it ends up being more or less rumbly based off of the frequency of the couch, which is kind of neat. But yeah, when they designed these subwoofers, they designed them to last because they're originally the prototypes that would be the first to use the sandwich design. See how like that's a woofer that's flat? Inside is actually a vented cone. So whatever internal ringing would be absorbed by the vented cone, and there's actually an air gap between the front diaphragm, the rear vented cone, and the vents. So anything that would happen inside the box wouldn't actually ring the front cone because it couldn't possibly reach it. It would just hit the rear cone instead. It's a pretty brilliant design, and it's a design that they've been using for all their low frequency drivers ever since. Right after they made these, they applied the same design to make the woofers on the blade. And you can see the same family. I mean, if you look at this and this, you can see how those two eventually kind of just, merged, had a little Pokemon evolution and became the blade. And so this was actually the 7th and 8th generation prototypes that led to eventually the new Uniq. That's why they're the first to actually have the reseated surrounds, and the full compression horn, I guess people call it now, whatever, because since only Cap has that, I don't know what the heck we call it, but it's a tangerine waveguide is what they call it. But this allowed for the freeing of the woofer to travel a lot more without causing any distortion to the tweeter. Whereas before, I'll show you. So this is my favorite setup for my, anything basically from the aughts backward. They actually sound a lot more live to me than the LS50s do. The LS50s sound really good when it comes to like, they're really great with holography. I have to give them that. And but they're a bit, I don't know, they just don't sound as live as, they don't have the same presence that these have. And it might be like what the, what a lot of people say about floor standers is that you just can't compare floor standers to bookshelves. But I tend to think it's more just the fact that companies design speakers, especially CAF, alongside studios. So when they design these, they design them with what the studio had in mind for how they wanted the sound to sound. So as you can see, I did a laser presentation, but you could actually see there's a little ring right here. Do you see the flare? That flare isn't an accident. It's not an artifact. That's actually the way the woofer is profiled. And I could show you the way that light reflects off of it if you want to see the effect of it. But that ring right there plays a very crucial role, and it plays along with the inner ring in there. As in, this reflects with this. And they always are aiming for a 90-degree or greater angle so that it shoots, outward and in a controlled fashion. But yeah, so in these older designs, the woofers are in the bottom, right? So when the bottom shakes and you have a lot of buildup of bass on the inside, then it's gonna cause the top to shake, because as goes the bottom goes the top, right? So sorry, it's clearing dust. Okay, so anyway, this was enough of a problem that they actually added this thing. This thing not only allows the shadow flare to do its job and unify the sound of the tweeter, the woofer, and allow it to strike at whatever angle of incidence that it needs to strike to unify the sound, so that the whole entire woofer sounds like it's actually coming from one solid single driver. But this is always cold to the touch, because this is actually made out of metal. This whole entire thing is actually a metal hood. Pretty cool design detail, and that was not brought back. I don't know if they're ever gonna bring it back, but the detail, it actually came from the 207s, the original reference line. The way they actually had the top in its own pod on top, and then the bottom, which is its own low end subsection, and the top pod eventually became the 301s or the 30Xs, while the Celestion AVPs became those guys. So meanwhile, in order to get the shadow flare to work well with this new concept surround and Unicode configuration that happened in the aughts when their patent expired, they also created these guys. So I pretty much just got everything that would let me test what they did. So what's interesting about these is that the way this is contoured, if you were to shine a laser at the tweeter, it reflects off of this thing, right? So this thing works as a waveguide to the tweeter. But see how this is actually a sharper angle than this? The tweeter and the mid actually meet here, but they don't meet here. So they unify their sound on this axis, but they don't unify the sound on this axis. The tweeter and the woofer are actually allowed to fire freely up and down. I'm not really sure why I mean, my first guess is that, our ears are side by side, but I would have preferred, I know why. I know why. Yeah, it's because these things are naturally, if you put them on a desk, they're naturally tilted upward. So there would be no need for them to actually do anything to eliminate floor boundary interference. But yeah, this was a example of their, playing around, prototyping. This is actually a flattened surround. The woofer actually continues right into the surround, and if you were to shine a light, you would see the light bounce off of here, it skim across here, and then it'd collect here. But you wouldn't see the same thing happen here. You'd actually see the light shine straight down. And that's what these were designed for, was just pretty much just a test to see if you could create a very small speaker, very compact, but have it sound as large as this. And it was a success. It actually does sound very big for what it is. Same thing happens here. If you were to shine a laser light, the light would actually bounce off of here. At the widest angle, the light actually ends up terminating here before it reaches, the actual ending of the baffle. So the front curved baffle just gives it more internal volume. It doesn't actually do anything as far as allowing, the woofer or the tweeter to reduce any edge diffraction, because the edge diffraction is entirely handled by the shadow flare, or what they eventually call the shadow flare. You'll see a lot of technology that they actually had in the past that they reintroduce but don't actually give a name to, or will rename. It's kind of like how the LSX has the SST technology, but it doesn't say it in the literature. The SST technology was derived specifically from the 3001 series, which was Kev's official reboot, their 7th and 8th generation Uniqs. So, meanwhile, while the eggs were pretty much just from the Celestion AVPs, which didn't sell very well, so Kev just took them over, stand, mounts, molding, metal, everything, and just recasted it, and they made a pretty successful speaker. Didn't have to spend very much on tooling, and they had a whole bunch of extra stands that were fully compatible. The stands, the mounts, the screws, the binding terminals, everything is identical to the AVPs. The only difference is the front and half parts of the cabinets themselves, which is what you needed to do to put the Uniq in there. And that's why it's not really designed perfectly. It's the design really should have had the Uniq extend out a bit further, but that's not an option they had, because these were actually designed. If you look up Celestion AVPs, you can see exactly where these came from. And this is what was the birth of the Egg series, which still exists. The Egg series, I think, is on like the 6th generation now, with the Egg Duos that just came out last year, and they still have the same exact form factor, just flipped upside down. The same tuning frequency at 2.7 kilohertz. Port frequency at 74. But yeah, that ring right there was eventually sliced off because they no longer needed this thing to perform as a waveguide, because that's actually what the original Uniq patent covered. It didn't actually cover placing a tweeter in the center. It covered the way that the tweeter interacts with the making unicues that are very similar to kept unicues, but other companies are actually making the same type of, like Bucart, where they're actually making waveguides that are this shape. Adrenal are another company that's making waveguides that are that shape, and they all have the same kind of like horn in the center and a ring right there, and then a flare. So that was actually a trade secret that they hid for a while, and it's kind of hidden in plain sight because most people were led to believe that the Unicube patent covered something to do with the tweeter and the woofer being coincidental in terms of like the actual sound they generate. But what it really covered was actually the way the sound interacts, the geometry between the two. And yeah, I love collecting these guys because you could actually see exactly what was covered in the patent profile, and the fact that there was a two-step process that made this profile, and it actually left a very, very telltale ring right there. And I'll show you once I find my laser what happens. I guess I can probably end the video there, but this is a slab of marble, and this thing is actually mass loaded. So originally this thing actually had plastic plinths, which were crap. So I just took a slab of marble instead, and then I think you can kind of see it. These things are actually glued down, like they're not glued down, but they're using museum gel, which is removable. But I just put a big handful of museum gel and I just kind of plopped it on there, and then I just set the speakers on top. So if I were to lift these speakers, this would lift along with it. So this is bonded with the speakers. So now the speakers are actually the same exact weight as this plus this. And then they're just, floating on the top of these guys. For my subwoofers, I just took my old practice amps. Figure they're nice boxes. And most of the boominess that comes from bass, especially when you have like hollow wooden floors, actually doesn't come from the physical contact of the subwoofer to the floor. And you'll actually notice that if you were to just take your subwoofer, compare a downward facing subwoofer and a forward facing subwoofer, right? One's gonna rumble the floor a lot more than the other. So by lifting the subwoofer up, even after breaking contact, you're still gonna get a lot of floor resonance, especially if you have a hollow hardwood floor, because the resonance actually comes from the sound itself, the sound pressure. Right now, I don't have another phone on right now, but there's actually less. I actually don't feel any rumble right here. I can hold the phone against the floor. Would that help? There's no rumble right now beneath this, like the subwoofer itself. Well, the subwoofer, you can hear that, is definitely rumbling. This is working as kind of like a riser, and I think it's gonna stick there because it seems to work fine. I don't think I have to buy a better riser than that. I have another one that I would use probably eventually, but I don't feel like doing that right now. But if you were to go to the back of the room, you can actually feel more rumble back here than you do up there, especially the back corner. I don't know if you hear the buzzing, but in my shoulder right now, I could definitely feel the bumps of the subwoofer, which is way more dramatic than what I feel up here, because it's actually all really coming from the fact that obviously the back of the room is where the bass is all going, and it's corner loaded against the floor and the wall. If I went into the corner, then I'd be like, tri-corner loaded, but I have stuff back there, so I can't really I don't want to move all this stuff out of the way. But yeah, I would recommend definitely raising your subwoofer if you have the chance. It tightens up the sound immediately. It tightens up the sound more than even like moving it back away from the back wall, I would say, because the origin of the sound, you have to remember, is right here. So what you're dealing with is moving this spot around. So technically, this spot is actually about 2 feet away from the back wall and about 3 feet away from the floor, which is pretty good. I really like the design. The reason why I am in love with these speakers is because they're the last to have this loop shape, which lets me toe them in so that even when towed in, it's actually parallel with the side walls, which is pretty cool. And the build quality is just freaking phenomenal. The fact that it has like a freaking top anchor, and the top anchor actually has some trusses that goes all the way down. So it's built like a skyscraper, where like the whole entire thing is meant to be. It's meant to prevent the top from wobbling. So anything that would happen up here would be absorbed by this anchor. But there's still the issue that I had, where whenever these two played and kicked very hard, the internals, I actually have the bottom one plugged, it would cause the whole entire thing to just, you get microphonics, right? And so when you have speakers in stereo and the tweeters are just moving slightly out of sync, you're gonna get some sound artifacts that are gonna make the sound a lot more loose. But ever since I mass loaded them, also added an ottoman. An ottoman, I would say, is probably one of the best things you can add to a room to help get rid of unwanted bass. But yeah, so that's the original Uniq before. So this thing was actually patented after B&O and Kef were hired by British universities to experiment with ambiphonic audio. So they actually were way ahead of their time. These things were designed for what we now call Atmos. They needed to have a sound that was full range, a driver that was full range, that could actually be manipulated by B&O Magic DSP to be able to do things like delete walls and play sound as if you were in any space. And they were studying pretty much the idea of channelless sound, the idea of making it so that any sound would sound like it could happen in any room, whether it be a cave, or whether it be in a forest, or whether it just be like, in what's it called, a whisper room. And they needed an array that was full range enough, that would be reliable enough, that through DSP they could actually delete sound. It wasn't about producing sound, it was about eliminating sound, because they wanted to eliminate all the sound from the room. And so back in 1988, I believe, was when these things were actually officially patented. So 1988 brings us Yeah, so 1988 brought us to about, so a patent lasts about, I think, 30 years in Britain, right? So about 2008 came. Right before 2008 came, these came. And these came alongside these. These were not intentionally made, like I was saying. These were actually made as like an offshoot of the Celestion AVPs, which were, they were okay, but they were kind of a commercial failure. So all the tooling, they were so high quality and they were just so well made that like it'd be such a waste to just not use the tooling. And if you know much about R&D, the amount of time and energy and money and resources spent to do the tooling to create something like this, especially when it comes with like a stand and all sorts of like accessories, and every single individual part has to be made from scratch. Of course Kep's gonna take that over. Yeah, so they didn't have to actually R&D this thing. They just did the typical Kep egg shape, and then they went ahead and made these as well out of the same metal, because they had the ability, they had the means, and so they had, you know, the moxie to do so. And in doing so, it allowed them to also test forward. So neither of these actually have the tangent waveguide. These started off with a silk dome, which is actually kind of interesting because it was kind of a backward step, because they weren't really sure what to do with these yet, and they were still perfecting them. These never quite sounded right. These sound okay, but they sure as hell marketed the hell out of them. That's what you do when you don't have to spend money in R&D. And these were lesser known, but they're actually, to me, they sound better. These were actually designed from scratch, and they are small and obviously like not gonna blow you back or anything, but they do sound really good for their size. They sound much bigger. They actually sound about this big in both ways, because the way that this curve here ends up merging the tweeter and the woofer, so that the sound actually ends up coming out like that, and radiating out that way, and it radiates up and down freely. So let's go back to the future. I also want to show you these. This is probably the coolest center design I've ever seen them make besides the 3000X, because it's actually bowed in the front. So it's it was actually a Diapolito configuration before they went Diapolito with their current series. So the mids and the low frequencies shoot out at a constructive interference pattern with the front unicube. So no matter where you're sitting, you're getting this pair, or you're getting that pair, or if you're sitting in the middle, you're getting this and these off axis. So the sound is extremely even. I went ahead and got this one without the tangerine waveguide because I wanted to have one of each. But yeah, they don't make these anymore. They now just make them flat, and I really wish they would bow their wood more. And Andrew Jones explains why they don't bow their wood as much as they used to. And so you can probably look at that interview yourself. So what's funny is that these are the limited edition black LS50s, and I was waiting for these to come out because I knew they would release a black one, like a solid black one eventually. Every company always waits till like their sales start to kind of dip, and then they release a black edition. It's also why, this exists. They, originally came out with, I need to clean it. They originally came out with the white ones, and they knew that people would wait for the black ones, and then they released the black ones. Because of course they would. These originally came in silver, and then they released the black ones, because of course they would. So these came in, all sorts of colors. And they did have black ones, but they had orange cones. And then they released the limited edition black ones completely. But what's neat is that these were actually made as the prototypes to the Metas. As you can see, the paint job on the side is actually the same paint job as on the Metas. They got rid of the glossiness, which is something I really prefer, because who the hell wants reflections, right? If you want to put them next to your TV, or especially in a projection room, why the hell would you want glossy speakers? That's like terrible. So these were actually the halfway prototype between the LS50s and the LS50 Metas. They finished making this. It's actually a very durable. It kind of reminds me of the paint they actually use on this thing, actually. But it's really durable. It's kind of almost like the stuff you paint the back of the bed of your pickup truck with. It's a really good matte paint that's very high quality. Has a nice velvet shimmer to it. But that's actually how all the Metas are now. So to make the Metas, they simply took this thing off, which they already did to add the black edition, and then now it says LS50 Metas, and they took the back, which already had these plugs. These plugs were actually used for the rods that would actually suspend this against this, so that the pressure would be something they call constrained layer dampening. So see how there's actually a gap? This plaque right here actually fits flush with this, and the port fits flush with that. All they did was they made a flat panel that would fit flush along the whole entire thing. So that way the panel now sits flush along with this, and then they added LS50 on the back and Meta underneath. So the LS50 Metas were pretty much just the 12th generation drivers with a new back panel, a new ring, and the paint job from the limited edition black caps, LS50s. But want to hear something cool? So right now you're listening to the LS50s. Now you're listening to these guys. So the reason why these took up so much work, and the reason why they're so over-engineered, is for the same reason why this thing has these 4 rods. This thing is fastened up against this thing against a soft glossy material. Wow, I need to clean this off. There's actually 2 rods, one right there, that fasten these 2 together against a solid seam, a solid rubber seam. Just like in between this, there's actually a rubber seam. So what Kef did was they basically used this as a way of perfecting their new Uniq. You can see that the ring is gone. The profile of the woofer is now completely different. They completely abandoned the need for the woofer to act as a waveguide to the tweeter, because look how deeply recessed the tweeter is now. This basically is a compression horn. And look how much more look how much more effect the blades of the Tangerine waveguide have. So and also, this is the first instance where they actually reseated the surrounds, and the reason why is notice how I'm bumping up against this. This right here is elevated on purpose. It's because this is actually where the tweeter and the woofer fire over the tweeter and merge. And they end up meeting right here. And I could show you with a laser video of how the geometry works on it. And it's actually pretty cool. No matter where you're firing, no matter what angle of incidence happens, the light will either fire at you or it'll end up bouncing off of either, from here to there, and then to there. And it's mechanically perfect. No matter where you go, it always zigzags in a way where eventually it meets right here. And that's the purpose of the convexed baffle that they end up adding to the blade. And why the blade has a convex baffle when the blade was actually designed by default, not convex, sorry, concaved. Why the blade was designed by default convexed, and they actually cut a hole into it so they could have a concaved baffle that went inward, is because they needed to implant the technology from this into the blade. While this thing has a convex baffle, and it doesn't have the same unity. It doesn't have the same big sound as 500 watts. That's gonna make a big difference too. But these are actually deliberately crippled a little bit. First of all, these actually have what's called the sealed suspension technology. Let's see, where did I put it? No matter how loud this thing plays, there's absolutely no way that air is actually going to be getting out between. There's actually a dampener right between the tweeter island and the woofer itself. The woofer itself is also dampened by these fins. These fins were also added to the back of the blade as a secondary part. So, although the blade, they switched over to a metal, like it's aluminum magnesium for their Uniq, they still actually have they call it like a liquid polymer backing that's this same shape, and allows for them to plant their voice coil a bit wider. So the thing plays like 500 watts, so it has a way oversized voice coil for what it is, and it also allows for them to add these cool stiffening fins, I guess I'm gonna call them. Everything's called a fin, from the tangent wave guide to these blades, fins. But it kind of works like a physical version of a heat sink. So anytime that there's any chance of there being any rumble, not only does it get absorbed by the gasket in there, but any back ringing would not only get absorbed by the extra surface area that these provide, but these also provide just straight up more. It's like a skeletal structure. It provides just more rigidity by being there versus just being a flat cone. So the two styles of woofers that they have are either just a flat stamped cone, which is what this thing has, which is why these things sound shouty at a louder volume, they actually don't have anything between the tweeter and the woofer. So when you turn it up particularly loud, they're designed to sound shouty, because you wouldn't want to sell something that would sound like the Blade if you just got 2 subwoofers, would you? These things don't sound shouty no matter how high you turn them up because of the SST technology. Switching back to the LS50s. So you can definitely hear the same family of the sound, like the same sound family. So this thing right here, we're the first to introduce not only the new style of the Unicube, it took 2 generations to actually perfect it. It was the 7th and the 8th generation, where they're able to fire both of the drivers out over the receded surround, which eventually led to the flattened surround. But beyond that, they actually got the ability to make a small speaker that could pump up bass like crazy. This thing for satellite is tuned at 2.2 kilohertz and at 52 hertz at the port. The same exact numbers as this guy. So the crossover frequency and the port tuning is very, very unlike a satellite. It's designed pretty much like what you would imagine how you would design the prototype of this thing, or something like a exotic bookshelf like a Gallows or something, Anthony Gallows or something. So the port actually fires downward at an angle. So no matter what, you're gonna actually get like there's actually these feet, just like with the all their other ones, that could be placed either on the back or on the bottom. So you can actually have them like as on your desktop as computer speakers, or you can mount them on your wall, and they pivot. But no matter how you have them on your wall, the port is never gonna face straight backwards. It's always gonna be facing diagonally off axis from the driver, which I thought was a pretty clever idea. They couldn't do that with this guy, since with this, essentially what they did was they took the driver, put it on this side, flattened this side, and then they didn't know what to do with the woofer, so they made it flexible to try to eliminate as much resonance as possible as the sound oscillates in and out. It works okay. This if you look at the waterfall chart, there's still some trouble below 350, and below 350 is where they found they could perfect these drivers to work as well as possible, and that's where the 3001 center, which actually was made to be the anchor of these, and they ended up becoming pretty much like the model that would become the model for the phantom image that these two combined would create. So when you play these two, the center image sounds exactly like the 3001 SE center. When you play these two, the center image sounds exactly like the 3001 SE center, because the 3001 SE center has a razor flat frequency response and is meant to be listened to on axis in mono, and that just makes sense. So that's the evolution of the Blade. It's pretty much, it went from the patent running out to them having to beat themselves, and the way they had to do that was they had to harken back to their legacy with the LS series, with the LS3 and the LS5 being like what they're first really known for. and those speakers were what defined studio broadcast monitors. Oh, I have another one of these as a model. This one is actually, yeah. It was funny is that you could tell when they're prototyping things, because notice how perfect this thing is. Now watch this. Notice how there's a big difference? So after they're done prototyping these things, they actually just continued making them, but they actually made the drivers like with less care. The tweeter is actually even different. They actually share, like, so these actually had 2 magnets, and they're actually very high quality, and you can see how like the woofer is like perfect. Whereas you can see how the woofer on this thing is kind of made more like, you know, wonky. They don't really care. They didn't really care as much. And it's not even just this one. They actually, here's the other one. So all the 2001 SEs just aren't made of the same quality, because the difference is that the woofer is no longer they're no longer coated with titanium. They're just kind of painted, and they share a single magnet now, so they just don't sound as good. Some people find their sound smoother, I guess, but I just find it a little bit more muddled. Yeah, so that's why I use those as my side surrounds, because I don't really care. I mean, they're just kind of like behind my ears anyway, so I don't really, as long as like the voicing sounds similar enough. But these things are really cool, so I just kind of keep them as a collector's edition, just because the technology behind them is actually pretty amazing. When you bring over to your friend's house or something and you compare them to a speaker much larger, they outperform them by a pretty large margin. And when I'm tilting it like this, you can see already how the light strikes the shadow flare there, but the shadow flare doesn't continue on the bottom, because, you know, we only listen to things side by side, right? And these things were only meant for this orientation and not for this orientation. Yeah, so to recap, these things took 2 generations. They took the top of the 2007s, the patent ran out, the ability to use the woofer as a waveguide was no longer theirs, so they had to find a way to reclaim their legacy. They were known for making the LS3s and LS5s, which were like classic monitors that were meant to be the best, most vivacious vocal machines. And so the family sound of the LS series is that they're just great with vocals, and they have and you can listen to them all day. They're the least fatiguing, but best at capturing the human voice. And if you learn anything from producing the LS series, that trickled across the industry. And even like Arnold Nudell wrote about that, about how if you capture the frequency range between 350 and 300 and 3000, and then kind of play a little bit of around 3000 and 6000, and then 8000 is an odd one, because 8000 is actually where sibilance is, and a lot of people use head filters anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But so what happens is between 350 and 3000 is where all the fundamentals of your voice are. That's where like the sound, like the soul of your voice is. Between 3000 and about 5000 is where the percussives are. That's where intelligibility comes from. That's where the vowels are broken up, and that's how you understand people even when they whisper, when there's no tone. So if you capture the human voice right, if you capture those ranges right, everything else falls into place, because human beings, just like we recognize human faces, And if a human face looks wrong, we immediately know it's wrong. It's called uncanny valley, right? If you get the human voice right, then everything else falls into place. Also, these speakers tend to be placed outward, and you tend to be sitting in the middle, so the crossover tends to be somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. Arnold Nudell tried to move that much lower or much higher, and that's why he invented the electromagnetic tweeter. But no matter what, like, physics causes the issue where the tweeter and the woofer has the issue where they tend to cross over between 3,000 and 2,000, which is where ears are most sensitive, unfortunately. So what happens is that the reflections from the room at the crossover region, when these two are playing at the crossover region, they're summing their signals, but they're also bouncing off of your side walls. So you're getting like much more than you need. So that's why they introduced what's called the BBC dip. Or later on, I guess Nudell added his own, so he called his the Nudell dip. But it would be a way of just accepting the fact that reality is real, and we all are in rooms, and rooms have side walls. And so when you have the woofer and the tweeter both firing at the same time, the side walls are gonna also be firing a reflection of both those. So you can get 4 sources of sound, and you can get a peak, and it's gonna hurt your ears, because your ears, even if it's risen a tiny bit, it's gonna hurt your ears over time. So they deliberately made these and matched the sound quality of like the voicing of the LS35As. And if you listen to Speaker Tony, he does an A/B comparison, and it's pretty amazing how much they got it. Like, they just nailed it. The sound signature is almost like indistinguishable. They sound exactly like one another, except for these obviously play lower and they play higher, and they sound a tad more refined, whereas the LS3s and LS5s sound a tad more live. They have more of that band inside of a box sound. These fall in between. These are incredibly smooth, and the fact they didn't add the SST in here crippled them so that they could never be as good as the Blade, no matter what you do, because it's impossible to retrofit that in there. But this has SSTs, so you could actually modify these to make them better. I've seen people modify these and make some pretty crazy stuff, but they often even use like the 3001 centers, because that already has a razor flat frequency response, and it has like the same exact distortion characteristics as like the pod to the Blade. They're bigger though, and they have the low frequency drivers on top and the bottom, which I guess you could use. So these took 2 generations to be created, the 7th and the 8th generation. They got these perfected no matter how far these blast, and these things play down on like 50 in room. It's incredible. What's funny is that since these things were so prototyped, they didn't even bother updating the literature. The box still shows the picture of the original, like even at the end of the, I guess, the life of this, of the design of this speaker, they still had the same box art from the first iteration, which meant, like, you know, it had the smaller driver, it had no tangent waveguide. It was pretty funny, and they just put like the SE sticker on there, and the where do I have it? Even the manual, they never updated the manual. The manual is actually still the manual to the original 3001s or 3000s. So they just like rushed to just make these as good as possible. Didn't care about anything else. They made the center as good as possible. Didn't care about anything else. And then once they were done, they literally just wiped them out of history. That's why, although